Today on the Daily Dose, early American imperialism. From the time the first settlers arrived in Virginia from England and started moving westward, writes Yale historian Paul Kennedy, this was an imperial nation, a conquering nation, while Ben Franklin wrote that hence the prince that acquires new territory, if he finds it vacant, or removes the natives to give his own people room. Combined with the Indian Wars and the ethnic cleansing campaign known as Indian removal, European American settlers embraced a policy of imperialism from the moment they set foot in North America. And while President George Washington enacted a policy of non-interventionism that lasted into the early 19th century, the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 drew a line in the sand, declaring North America off-limits to further European colonization, which in turn gave rise to the national drive of Manifest Destiny, announcing an open season for westward expansion toward the Pacific Ocean. While President Thomas Jefferson negotiated the 828,000 square mile Louisiana Purchase from Napoleonic France, an additional 525,000 square miles was added by force after the United States victory in the Mexican-American War of 1846, leading then Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt to proclaim at the onset of hostilities that I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one. While others, like Senator Sam Houston of Texas, proposed the annexation of Mexico, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, and San Salvador, such expansionist sentiment was put into action by physician, lawyer, journalist, and mercenary William Walker, who launched a privately funded occupation of Nicaragua in 1855, until he and his paid mercenaries were ejected from the country by a coalition of Central American armies. But perhaps the biggest proponent of new imperialism was President Theodore Roosevelt and his big stick corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, where he successfully acquired or annexed Spain's remaining island colonies of Puerto Rico, Cuba, Guam, the Philippines, and Hawaii, following the brief yet decisive American victory in the Spanish-American War of 1898. While late 19th century American imperialism was met with criticism by many at the time, American politicians justified foreign land grabs as protecting and expanding markets for American products, at the same time spreading the virtues of American democratic governance and Christian values. The period was also seen as a natural offshoot of what historian John Fiske called Anglo-Saxon racial superiority, or what Rudyard Kipling poetically called the white man's burden, all the while supported by America's open embrace of social Darwinism and Manifest Destiny. Today on the Daily Dose, filibusters in Central America. Under the banner of Manifest Destiny and a nascent sense of white supremacy, between the Mexican-American and Civil Wars, ambitious Americans attempted repeated land grabs in Central and South America, earning the name of filibusters or filibustero in the Spanish. Among the most successful or unsuccessful, dependent upon his ultimate fate, was lawyer and newspaperman William Walker, who moved from New Orleans to Northern California, where he recruited a small band of largely failed gold miners for a planned takeover of Baja, Mexico. Sailing out of San Francisco Bay with a ragtag crew of 45 men, Walker arrived in Cabo San Lucas at the end of October 1853, capturing La Paz by early November. His ranks swelled to over 300 enthusiastic mercenaries, until his lack of leadership and his beleaguered supply chain forced his retreat towards San Diego, where he surrendered to a detachment from the U.S. Army. Acquitted by a San Francisco jury in just 8 minutes' time, a testament to the strength of public opinion in Walker's favor, a year later, Walker took advantage of a civil war in Nicaragua, capturing the city of Granada before declaring himself president of the country in October of 1855. After Walker revoked shipping magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt's right to transit Nicaragua, Vanderbilt raised a private army that was soon joined by anxious forces from Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, forcing Walker from power in less than 10 months' time, only to receive a hero's welcome upon his return to the States. In 1860, Walker launched yet another filibustering or freebooting campaign, as it was commonly known, this time in Honduras, quickly drawing the ire of the British government, which still had strategically important colonies in Central America. The Royal British Navy captured Walker upon his arrival in Trujillo, turning him over to Honduran authorities, who executed him by firing squad in September of that same year, at just 36 years of age. 8 months later, upon the outbreak of the American Civil War, filibustering faded into obscurity, while the uniquely American belief in manifest destiny fizzled out by 1867, making filibustering in Central America one of the oddest overreaches in American history. Today on the Daily Dose, the Monroe Doctrine. By the dawn of the 1820s, many Latin American countries had won independence from Spain and Portugal, yet Britain and the United States worried that European powers would yet again try to colonize the Western Hemisphere. While President James Monroe at first favored a joint U.S.-British resolution against future colonization, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams distrusted Britain's own colonial intentions, convincing Monroe to make a unilateral statement of U.S. policy, which he delivered to Congress on December 2, 1823. At the time of Monroe's bold message that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to European interference, the young nation lacked enough military clout at the time, which made Monroe's assertion somewhat pointless until the United States became a dominating world power. Not until the Civil War ended would the Monroe Doctrine come of age, when the U.S. government sent military and diplomatic aid to Benito Juárez in Mexico, which allowed his forces to overthrow French-supported Emperor Maximilian from the throne. Theodore Roosevelt was next to invoke the Monroe Doctrine when he used it to justify a succession of U.S. interventions in Latin America. Known as the Roosevelt Corollary, or his Big Stick policy, after Roosevelt took office in September of 1901, he intervened militarily in Central America and the Caribbean, including Nicaragua, Haiti, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. FDR later softened Roosevelt's Big Stick policy with his Good Neighbor policy, which ushered in a period of greater cooperation between North and South American countries. But at the same time, FDR invoked the Monroe Doctrine repeatedly to intervene over affairs in a number of South and Central American countries. During the Cold War, President John F. Kennedy invoked the Monroe Doctrine during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, followed by President Ronald Reagan, who invoked the Monroe Doctrine for U.S. interventions in El Salvador and Nicaragua. President George H.W. Bush was the last president to invoke the Monroe Doctrine, when he sanctioned a U.S.-led invasion of Panama in an effort to oust corrupt Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega. Today on the Daily Dose, Wilsonianism. As the horrors of World War I approached its final months of bloody conflict, taking the lives of some 40 million people, on January 8, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson outlined his now famous 14 points as a basis for ending the war while promoting world peace for future generations. Woven into his 14 points was a call for democracy instead of authoritarian rule, the later, Wilson believed, contributing greatly to the outbreak of the First World War. He also called for conflict resolution bodies such as the League of Nations and the United Nations, as well as an emphasis on the spread of capitalism and self-determination among nation-states. Wilson also called for collective security by means of a new sense of liberal internationalism instead of isolationism, including freedom of the seas, open borders, and an end to secret treaties between nations. In his own words, Wilson advocated for the General Association of Nations for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike, and in a later speech to Congress, that national aspirations must be respected while allowing people around the world to be governed by their own consent. Wilson's 14 points launched an intense wave of optimism within colonial-ruled nations in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, elevating Wilson to an almost godlike figurehead in colonial-ruled states around the world, prompting Indian nationalist Ganesh Shankar Vijayarthi to hail Wilson as the modern apostle of freedom. Optimism within colonial-ruled nations proved short-lived, however, when the June 28, 1919 signing of the Treaty of Versailles failed to end colonial rule of First World countries over Third World nations, descending citizens of marginalized countries into a communal state of disillusionment and continued despair. Some historians have suggested that not only did the punitive demands the treaty placed on Germany lead directly to the Second World War, but the treaty's complete rejection of Wilsonianism, as Wilson's 14 points are known today, led to a number of protest movements in colonial-ruled nations, including the Egyptian Revolution of 1919, Mahatma Gandhi's passive resistance movement in India, the March 1st movement in Korea, and China's 1919 May 4th movement, making Woodrow Wilson's 14 points a telling missed opportunity for world peace. And there you have it, Wilsonianism, today in the Daily Dose. Get your nerd on with the Daily Dose. And if you enjoyed today's episode, share the link with a friend or colleague so that they too can learn something new every day.